tonight's theme, which is, of course, pride. Pride, 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 pride. I have got some more facts about pride and LGBTQ history for you. But this time it is going to be specifically on the Stonewall Uprising or riots. Because I feel like there's a whole lot that even queer people don't really know. I think it's a lot of assumptions, which are correct a lot of the time, but this was really fun for me as a queer person to learn more about our history, and I have compiled 10 facts for you about some of the most interesting parts of the Stonewall riots. So let's get into it. Fact number 1. Stonewall Inn was a rare safe haven. The Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, New York City, was one of the few places at the time where LGBTQ plus people could socialise openly in 1960s New York, despite frequent police raids. In the 1960s, life for LGBTQ plus people in the US specifically was incredibly challenging. Queer identities were largely criminalised, and discrimination was woven deeply into daily life. People risked losing their jobs, their homes, their families, and their physical safety if they were discovered as being queer. Bars, cafes, and social clubs frequently banned gay or openly gay or trans patrons. Police also routinely targeted queer communities, raiding gathering spaces, arresting individuals, and particularly trans and gender non-conforming individuals, subjecting them to physical violence, public shaming, or unjust detention, so arresting them for no reason. Arrest records could be published in newspapers, and that would destroy people's reputations and lives. Of course, it's not a shameful thing to be gay, but at the time that could cost you your entire livelihood and personhood. Fact number 2. The riot was sparked by a specific woman's arrest. So many accounts vary, but many witnesses say that a butch-presenting lesbian being manhandled by police and crying out to the crowd might have been the final spark. She allegedly shouted, "Aren't you going to do something?" Her name was never officially recorded, but some believe that she may have been Stormé DeLavery, who was a mixed-race lesbian activist. Fact number 3 is that June 28th, 1969 marked a massive turning point. I think it's also funny that the moon landing happened in 1969. Just a lot happened then, a lot of change, a lot of momentous occasions. So it happened on a warm, humid night in Greenwich Village, and it was just past midnight on June 28th of 1969. The Stonewall Inn was filled with queer patrons looking for community and comfort, and suddenly a very familiar yet terrifying sight appears in the form of yet another police raid. Officers, they enter aggressively, turning off the music and harshly questioning people. They demand identification and arrested those dressed in clothing that didn't match their assigned gender at birth, and openly mocked or pushed patrons around, which was something that the patrons were used to, but this time the atmosphere shifted from uneasy compliance to intense frustration. Something changed that night, and instead of quietly accepting the mistreatment, patrons began resisting. As police tried to roughly force people into police vans, a crowd gathered gathered outside, growing quickly. Legend holds that the patrons started throwing spare change, bricks, mocking police corruption, and soon after they start throwing bottles, rocks, more bricks, and this is just responding to years of violence, humiliation, and injustice across the entire community. In this powerful moment of resistance, patrons, they all linked arms, shouted, and formed kick lines, defiantly facing police batons and threats. Police retreated into the bar, barricading themselves in as the crowd outside chanted, "Gay power, and we shall overcome." Fact number 4 is a tribute to Marsha P. Johnson, who was an icon of resistance. Marsha P. Johnson, a black trans woman and activist, is famously credited with playing a key role during these riots, and she remains a symbol of queer resistance. Marsha P. Johnson was vibrant, charismatic, and deeply beloved, and her presence in Greenwich Village was described as being like sunshine by people who knew her. She was known for her radiant smile, flower crowns, and generosity, and she became one of the most influential figures in LGBTQ+ history. On the night of the Stonewall riots, Marsha was one of the earliest to courageously resist police aggression. While the exact details are debated, many recall her bravery very clearly, throwing objects such as bricks, rallying the crowd, and standing firm against the violence and arrest. Her courage inspired others to stand their ground. After Stonewall, Marsha became deeply involved with activism. Alongside her close friend Sylvia Rivera, she founded STAR, or Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, and this was a groundbreaking organization dedicated to providing shelter, food, and care for homeless queer youth, especially trans and gender non-conforming youth of color, which is still a massively underserved population to this day. I think an important note is too that she does use the word transvestite, which is now kind of considered a slur. But that's simply because the word transgender just really didn't exist back then. And throughout her life, Marsha identified in various different ways, using terms like gay, queen, drag queen, and transvestite, because the term transgender was not widely used in her lifetime. And today we respectfully remember her and honor her as a black trans woman, because judging by accounts from her friends and people that knew her closely, that's most likely the identity that she would assume today if she had the language to do so. Marsha's tireless advocacy and joyful defiance, as well as selfless generosity, continued to inspire queer activism and liberation movements all around the world. Fact number 5 similarly pays tribute to Sylvia Rivera, another voice for the marginalized. Sylvia Rivera was a fearless and passionate trans activist of Puerto Rican and Venezuelan descent. Living most of her life in poverty and often homeless, Sylvia experienced firsthand the intersecting struggles of being trans, Latina, and unhoused in a world that constantly tried to silence her. She was just 17 years old during the Stonewall riots. That night, she stood at the front lines, throwing a bottle, shouting back at the police, and refusing to back down. Sylvia later described Stonewall as a moment when queer people finally fought back against centuries of oppression. It was a breaking point, and she helped ignite that spark. But Sylvia's activism did not stop there. As I mentioned earlier, after the riots, she co-founded STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, with her friend Marsha P. Johnson. She spent decades fighting for inclusion, speaking loudly and emotionally when trans people, drag queens, and queer people of side by more respectable LGBTQ voices. Her resilience really was legendary, and she is quoted as once saying, "Hell hath no fury, like a drag queen scorned." Fact number 6. And I was really surprised to know this, maybe I'm just ignorant, at least I was. But there was actually 6 nights of resistance during the Stonewall Uprising. It was not just one single burst of rebellion, it stretched over 6 intense nights, making it one of the first and longest sustained LGBTQ plus protests in the US. The crowd was mostly made up of queer youth of colour, trans people, drag queens, and homeless LGBTQ teens, all fighting back. And over the next 5 nights, protests just swelled. Greenwich Village became sort of an impromptu battleground. Protesters chanted, sang, and clashed with riot police. Graffiti declaring gay power appeared, garbage cans were lit on fire, streets filled with a rising, joyful anger, and crowds came and went, some drawn by word of mouth, others returning again and again. But why did it last so long? And, people can really only speculate, but it's because largely that the pain was very deep. LGBTQ plus people had faced decades of police brutality, constant surveillance, and humiliation, and because finally someone said no more, and the world listened. Fact number 7 is that it wasn't the first LGBTQ plus uprising. So Stonewall was actually not the first active queer resistance. There were earlier protests, including Compton's cafeteria riot in San Francisco, which was 3 years prior in 1966. This was led by trans women. And also the Black Cat Tavern protest in LA in 1967, so just 2 years prior, after police beat and arrested patrons on New Year's Eve. Both of these events were powerful and brave acts of resistance, but they didn't create the same lasting national movement as Stonewall, and this was for a few key reasons. One of these reasons is there was just limited media coverage. LGBTQ plus issues were considered taboo at the time, and many publications refused to acknowledge them, so the uprisings didn't reach a broader audience or spark widespread public support. And specifically at Compton's, not even one photo is known to exist from the night of the riot. A second reason for that is that there were less visible follow-up movements. After the riots, there weren't immediate, large-scale activist groups formed with the same bold public identity that followed Stonewall, like the Gay Liberation Front or ACT UP. I talked about those in my Facts About Pride video if you're interested in those. Organisers were often older or more conservative, advocating quietly for legal reforms rather than radical visibility. And the third reason that these protests did not spark the same movement as Stonewall is that there was just intense stigma and police retaliation. At Compton's, the protest was largely led by trans women, drag queens, and sex workers, groups who were especially criminalized and marginalized, even within the gay community itself. We hadn't quite grasped intersectionality yet, sorry. Another reason is that, police crackdowns were brutal and unrelenting, and there were no protections for gender non-conforming or same-sex behaviour. Protesters risked arrest, job loss, homelessness, or forced institutionalization. Fact number 8. Very interestingly, the mafia owned the Stonewall Inn. The Genovese family, they're Italian-American, so they probably would call it the Genovese crime family, ran Stonewall and bribed the NYPD to avoid raids, but still kept it illegal and unlicensed. They served watered-down drinks, had no fire exits, and blackmailed wealthy queer patrons by threatening to out them. So it was both a haven and an exploitation site, to be honest. Fact number 9 is that street kids and homeless LGBTQ+ youth led the charge. This is something that I am incredibly proud to hear. I served as a mental health counsellor to a lot of LGBTQ+ youth who were kicked out for their identities, and there is not a more resilient, inspiring and worthy of empowerment group than those teenagers and young people. Many of the most visible fighters were unhoused queer youth, often teens and young adults rejected by their families. This still goes on today at incredible rates. They were used to surviving police violence and led much of the resistance with boldness and creativity. Not surprising to me. And finally, the last fact, fact number 10, is that Stonewall is largely considered to be the birth of the gay liberation movement. The Stonewall riots galvanized the formation of key activist groups like the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activists Alliance. The very next morning after the riots, flyers were distributed by the Mattachine Society, and the newly formed Gay Liberation Front was urging people to return and protest again. This quick mobilization marked a shift from the quiet assimilation to public radical activism. And exactly 1 year after Stonewall, activists held the first Pride March in New York City. This was originally known as Christopher Street Liberation Day. And there you have it. I thought a lot of those were so interesting, and I had no idea about many. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you found it relaxing. I hope you learned something like I did. Keep learning. It's really interesting and it's important. But right now you got to get you some sleep. So be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and I will see you in the next video.